So this is the lecture on the rest of the skeleton, anything outside of the skull, which we finished in the last lecture. All right, so first off, you're going to have what's basically going to have your axial skeleton, which means your skull, your vertebrae going all the way down, and then also your thoracic cage, which then also includes your arms down to your fingers, your pelvic cage going from your hip all the way down to your toes. I'm going to cover all that. Now, what I'm going to cover is what you're liable for. Again, it's in your manual from pages, I think, 83 to 93. So those bones, those features of those bones, you're liable for, and that's what I'm going to be hitting. Again, if you go on Google and look this stuff up, there's going to be more features than what you're liable for, so don't make yourself crazy by shoving more in thinking that you're liable for it. I'm only going over what you're liable for. All right, first off, coming on down then, we went over the skull. One bone we have to talk about, which is a very, very strange, unique bone. It's called the hyoid bone. It's located right here. It's holding open it's right at the top of your larynx, and it's basically holds open the airway. What it looks like is this, okay? Kind of looks like the bottom jaw of a bulldog, with a little snaggle tooth sticking up. Again, it's going to fit right here, okay? What makes it unique? It is the only bone in the human body that does not articulate with any other bone. Doesn't have any joints. It's sitting right here. Its main job is to keep the airway open. Whenever they do an autopsy and they try to figure out if somebody was strangled to death, if you put pressure on someone's neck, you'll snap the hyoid bone, which will then crush the windpipe, and that's one way you can tell. All right, but that's the hyoid bone, H-Y-O-I-D. Now, more importantly, going down the spine. All right, so you have cervical, thoracic, lumbar vertebrae, then you have your sacrum, and then you have your coccyx, your tailbone. So, easy way to remember it, you have to know this, okay? Just think breakfast, lunch, dinner. You have 7 cervical vertebrae, 7 o'clock in the morning for breakfast. You have 12 thoracic vertebrae, 1 for each rib. 12 ribs, 12 thoracic vertebrae, that's lunch. And then you're going to have 5 lumbar, dinner time. So that's that's the bottom part of your back. Now, the sacrum, when you were developing inside mommy, was 5 separate bones. However, it fuses to make one big bone. Your coccyx, your tailbone, was 4 separate bones while you were inside mommy. It fused to make one bone when you were born too. All right, so what you have to be able to do is understand the basic structures of any general vertebrae, and then I'm going to walk you through how to tell a cervical from a thoracic from a lumbar. Okay, so it's again 7, 12, 5. So, here. In general, for vertebrae, what you're going to have kind of looks like a roof on top, and it comes in like that. And you're going to have this big round piece down here. Okay? So, this right here is a hole. That's what your spinal cord goes through. So, let's talk about some basic things. Everything that's above this whole area, that is called the vertebral arch. It's the arch from one side to the other side. The arch is composed of 2 things. You have a pedicle, which basically means the little foot on each side. And then you have the back part of this, and this is called the lamina. If a person suffers from spina bifida, it just means when their backbone was forming, the lamina did not fully solidify. So basically, you either have an opening or a crack, so they're leaking cerebrospinal fluid, which means they're paralyzed from that point down. Cool thing about that is that today's current technologies, that can be repaired in utero while you're still in mommy and the baby's born fine. Now, so the pedicles and the lamina together make up the vertebral arch. The bottom part, which is solid bone, that's what's going to give you support for your body. This is called one of 2 names. It's either called the centrum, like the vitamin, or it's simply called the body of the vertebrae. Okay, so it's the body that holds up the mass, but the proper name is the centrum. Now, along with that, this hole in the middle, that is called the vertebral foramen. The vertebral foramen is the hole for your spinal cord. Then you notice on the lamina we have these 3 points. The points that come off the sides, on both sides, those are called transverse processes. They stick out from the sides like wings. This top one is called a spinous process. Think about if you go to the beach, somebody's in front of you and they bend down and you can see all the little bumps running down their back. What you're looking at are their spinal processes running down their back. Okay. Now, Other things that other vertebrae have that I can't really draw, because what you're essentially looking at is, I drew a sketch of that. That is that. Okay? Now, other things that you have to know for each vertebrae. Whenever I went over the lecture about the different features, processes, and I went over facets. Okay, so if you come closer, just so we understand, that's the body. Those are your transverse process, your spinous process. Your lamina, this whole area is the arch. That is the centrum, and that hole in the middle is, I almost got my fingers stuck, is the vertebral foramen. Okay? Now, if I take this, again, how it looks like on me looking at you right now, I take the spinous process and I tilt it back. So the spinous process always goes down and out. That's how you know it's upright. If it were like this, I'm standing on my head. So if I take this now and I tilt the vertebrae around, there's two little smooth facets right here. Those are called the superior articulating facets. If I then go underneath it, those two right there, those are called the inferior articulating facets. As I was explaining in the first lecture, vertebrae slide down on top of one another and up underneath one another. So therefore, when you take a bow or when you move your back, they slide past one another and they glide and slide as they go up and down. Okay? Now you got to understand too that in between these, you learned in histology, you're going to have your intervertebral discs in between them. That's made of fiber cartilage. The whole purpose of it is so that vertebrae does not hit vertebrae, because if that happens, you have what's called a slip disc or a disc rupture, and that's a new level of pain every time you move that you don't want to experience. Okay? Now, one other trait I have to explain, which is going to be sort of difficult because I don't have two of the same vertebrae. Just seeing if I can jerry-rig something here. If I do something like this, okay? If I take the superior articulating facets of one vertebrae and the inferior articulating facets of another, and I slide them down on top of one another like that, notice what I make is a hole right there, okay? That hole is called an intervertebral foramen. It's the hole in between vertebrae. What is that for? Well, understand the vertebral foramen's for your spinal cord to go through. Well, then how does the spinal cord go out to your arms, your fingers, your legs, your toes to be able for you to coordinate, communicate with each other? Well, the nerve endings have to come out through the intervertebral foramen to go to the rest of your body. So that's the exit point for communication. All right? So all vertebrae are going to have those. The ones I just drew for you, and then also the superior, inferior articulating facets and the intervertebral foramen. All right, now let's talk about the different types of vertebrae. So, again, how many cervical vertebrae you got? 7, okay? Now, the cervical vertebrae are going to have two very unique features, a third one if you want to call it unique. So, this one is a cervical vertebrae. Notice a couple things. This is my spinous process. Those are my transverse processes. One thing that should jump out at you is that the spinous process isn't solid, like that one. It's split. That is called a bifid spinous process, B-I-F-I-D. That's the first unique trait. Second unique trait, if you notice, underneath the transverse processes, there's a hole. Whereas underneath these transverse processes, there's no hole. Okay, those are called the transverse foramen. What are those for? Well, if you look at the base of your skull, again, you're going to have your foramen magnum. The foramen magnum, you have to understand, is where the main spinal brainstem comes out in the spinal cord. But also understand you have what are called cranial nerves, which come out of the base of the skull, go underneath the skull to nerve endings of your neck, and they come around to your face. Well, those nerves have to come out through a different porthole besides this one. Where they pass through is going to be through those little holes. All right, so cervical vertebrae, there are 7. What makes them unique? Bifid spinous process, transverse foramen, last but not least, not really a great trait, but if you notice, the centrum is teeny. The bigger the centrum, the more weight it's holding up. This is only holding up your head, so it doesn't have to be enormous yet. All right? Now, in cervical vertebrae land, however, cervical vertebrae number 1 and number 2, we have to pay special note to. So this is like a regular run-of-the-mill cervical vertebrae. This would be like cervical vertebrae like number 4, okay? So whenever you go to a chiropractor and they say something like C1, C7, they mean cervical vertebrae number 1, 7, whatever. T2, 6 would be thoracic 6. L3 is lumbar 3. All right, so this is cervical vertebrae number 1. This is called the atlas. Why? Think Roman mythology. Who was Atlas? Atlas is the individual who holds the world on his back. This is the first vertebrae, and it holds up your world. If you remember from the skull lecture, you have your occipital condyles. The occipital condyles, sit right on those. So the occipital condyles sit right on top of those. Why? So you can go, yes. Now, why is it called the atlas? Because the head is your world. It's holding up your world. That's why it's called the atlas. Know that. Next, I'll put that over there. We have this one. This is cervical vertebrae number 2. This is called the axis, A-X-I-S. Notice if I take this and I spin it around, it has this little nub sticking out. It's called one of two names, the odontoid process or the dens, D-E-N-S. Why is that significant? So if I take this, lay it like this, grab my atlas that I just threw up there without thinking. The atlas sits right on top of the axis, like that. Like this, sorry, like that. And therefore, have it upside down, like that. And therefore, when you turn your head, you rotate around the axis. So this is you going no, okay? So when you go that's the occipital condyles. When you go no, that's the atlas going side to side around the axis, okay? So cervical vertebrae number 1, atlas, cervical vertebrae number 2, the axis, and that's the dens or odontoid process. And again, that was a generic cervical vertebrae, bifid spinous process, transverse foramen, centrum is small. Again, 7 cervical vertebrae in total. Now, next, going down, you have 12 of these. Those are thoracic vertebrae, 1 for each rib. Now, notice it was the generalized picture I gave you, as all the general features. How you know it's going to be thoracic? Real simple. If it's 1 for each rib, if you come closer, notice there's a little notch right there, and there's a little notch right there. Those are notches for the rib to attach. So this is going to be the facet for the head of the rib. This is right here on the transverse process is the facet for the rib tubercle. So this is the rib head, that's the rib tubercle. If there's the facet for the rib head, it touches there, then the rib tubercle hits there. So your ribs, you have to understand, they don't just come straight out. They first attach, they bow out, then come to the front, to the sternum. Okay? So there's 12 of these. And again, how can you tell? It's going to have the facet for the rib head and the facet for the rib tubercle. That's how you tell. Last but not least, then, 5, lumbar. Lumbar are just huge, okay? Another way to tell a thoracic, which is kind of unique, if you look at the shape of the, take a look at the shape of the centrum, kind of looks like a heart. We'll understand the ribs go around the heart, so it's an easy way to remember it. When you get to a lumbar, it just looks like a big fat pumpkin is what it looks like, just huge. Lumbar are going to be the biggest, the biggest centrum because again it's holding up all the weight of the entire torso. So there's nothing really substantially woohoo fantastic about this is a lumbar and here's unique features, except for it has a big fat centrum because it's holding up the weight. Again, 5 of those. So again, 7 cervical, 12 of the thoracic, and 5 lumbar. All right. Now coming on down, then you have the sacrum. As I told you, this was originally inside when you were in mommy, you had 5 of these. These holes tell you the levels. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They were 5 separate bones. However, when you're born, they all fuse to make 1. So it's 1 sacrum. Okay? Now, understand what that means then is when you have a hip. Those would be lumbars, and there's your sacrum. What's it doing? It's holding the back of your pelvis together. Okay, which we'll come back to later on once we go over the hips. So all you have to know is sacrum. All right. Last but not least, that's your coccyx. That's your tailbone. Okay. Now again, whenever you're inside mommy, that was 4 bones. However, as you become close to birth, it fuses to make 1. Okay, so it's just called a coccyx, C-O-C-C-Y-X. So yes, when you're in mommy, you had a tail. Hopefully you reabsorbed it. All right, so that is the spine. All right, now let's continue on the back. Okay, so let's finish up the back first, then I'll come to the front part of your torso. That is a scapula. Okay, now there are going to be 5 bones. You're going to have to be able, when you look at them, to distinguish, is it a left or is it a right? This first one, scapula, is going to be the first bone you got to be able to tell left and right. The other 5 are going to be the humerus, the upper arm, the coxa, which is a hip, the femur, upper leg, and then the tibia. So those 5 bones you have to be able to look at, tell me whether it's left or right. So how do I tell? If you look at this, now the thing about the manual, they show you a scapula, but it looks like this. It doesn't tell you a hell of a lot, because it basically doesn't look like anything, which is why I like to show the whole thing. So, how can you tell? Your shoulder has to attach here. This flat part has to run parallel to your spine. So, if you do this, this would have to be a right one. Okay? Because it has to be flat to my spine and my shoulder has to attach to it. So, you have to know scapula. You have to know is it left or right by what I just showed you. Next, the features. When you look at this, you see this large ridge coming right there. This would be the ridge you have right here on your back coming to the end. So this is called the scapular spine. The scapular spine terminates at something called the acromion. Go back to Unit 1 when we talked about regional terms, and I said shoulder was called acromial. It's called acromial because that is the acromial process. So the scapular spine terminates at the acromial process right here. But now if I move this for you, notice there's another process in front of it. That is called the coracoid process, C-O-R-A-C-O-I-D. In between it is this big hollowed out area, and that's called the glenoid fossa. The glenoid fossa is what you would call your shoulder socket. Okay? Now, how that works, your humerus, the head, would fit right in there. And therefore, that's how you spin it around. Okay? Now, what you got to know then for scapula. Scapula, left or right. Scapular spine, acromial process, coracoid process, glenoid fossa. All right. Next, we'll go forward to the front. Okay? So, next one is this. That's your sternum. Okay? Now, when you do a sternum, a couple things you notice. The whole thing is called a sternum. All right? This upper part right here is called the manubrium. This part right here is called the sternal body, and this little thing sticking off the bottom is called the xiphoid process, X-I-P-H-O-I-D. All of them make up the sternum. Other things you have to know on the sternum. If you notice, there's a notch here, 2 notches here, and then other notches here. So it kind of looks like a bow tie. It's the knot of a bow tie. This right here, you can do it yourself. Take your finger and you put it right there. Okay? Because if you go left or right, you'll notice you'll feel a bone there. That's your clavicle. Your clavicle, your collarbone comes in from each side and attaches there. So this right here in the middle is called the jugular notch. Or, like I said earlier, a notch can be called a sulcus. These two would then be the clavicular notches. So the clavicle would come in like that. Okay? Actually, like that. All right? So, those are the 2 clavicular notches. Jugular notch, clavicular notches. And then these last ones on the sides, that is the articulation for rib number 1. So rib number 1 comes and attaches. Now rib number 1 is a joint that's not designed to move. The whole idea is it's basically attaching your spine, your vertebrae, to your torso. So therefore, like when you swing your arms, you don't spin around like a merry-go-round, okay? It's basically holding that together. All right, so what do you have to know? Sternum. The top part is called the manubrium, sternal body, xiphoid process. Then we have jugular sulcus or jugular notch, clavicular notches, and articulation for rib 1 on both sides. Okay? Now, coming up then, we come to your ribs. How many ribs do you have? 12. It's things you got to know. Ribs 1 through 7 are called true ribs. Ribs 8 through 12 are called false ribs. Why? Ribs 1 through 7 have their own cartilage going directly to the sternum. That makes them true. 8 through 12 either use some other rib's cartilage to go to the sternum, or they don't attach at all to the sternum. So, directly, I mean, with cartilage, or not at all, period. So, 1 through 7 are called true ribs. 8 through 12 are called false ribs. Now, once you get to 11 and 12 basically don't attach to anything. They're at the bottom. They're covering the top part of your kidney. Those are called floating ribs. So floating ribs are a type of false rib. Yeah, it is 1 through 7 or 1 through 8. I'm questioning myself now. Anyway, the rib. What you got to know then, real simple, is when you see it, you go, oh, that's a rib. Now again, the rib's going to have two parts to it. If the part that you look at looks kind of hollowed out, that's where the cartilage would go to the sternum. That is not the head. The head would look solid. So that's the rib head, and then behind it is the rib tubercle, the bump. Why is that significant? Because in the thoracic vertebrae, if you remember, has an articulation for the rib head on the body, and then an articulation for the rib tubercle on the transverse process. All right, again, 12 of those. All right. Last but not least, we have the collarbone, the clavicle. That's your clavicle. So that part, actually I had it backwards before. I had your end of your clavicle coming in like this. It's this that comes in. Anyway, unimportant. But your clavicle looks like that. Okay? Scapula. Clavicle would come in kind of like that. Okay? To help make the socket for your arm. All right? Now, all you have to know is when you see this, you go, oh, clavicle. You don't have to know left or right, just it's a clavicle. It's one of the most frequently broken bones in the human body. All right, what we just finished then was the hyoid bone, the vertebrae all the way down. We finished then the scapula, the thoracic cage, the manubrium, and the ribs. Now we got to go from your arm down to your fingers. So, next bone, humerus. Okay, humerus, again, you got to know left and right. How can you tell? First off, the head is where it attaches to your body. This part that sticks out has to point to your rib cage. And if I take this and flip it around, notice there's a big, huge dent in the back. That has to face posterior. So if I do this, this has to fit like that. Okay, so this is a right arm. All right, because that has to attach to my shoulder. This has to point to my rib cage, and that big divot has to point toward the back. So you got to know humerus. You got to know left and right. Other features you got to know. As you know, was a characteristic that I showed when I went over the anatomy of a long bone. We have a diaphysis. We have two epiphyses. Along with that, on the closer surface, I can't think right now. Distal, medial. On the closer surface, you have the head. Now, when you look at this, there's two tubercles. You have one above, one below. This one above is called the greater tubercle. The one below is called the lesser tubercle. Greater and lesser does not mean bigger or smaller. Greater means above, lesser means below. And in between them, there's a little groove. That is called the intertubercular groove or the intertubercular sulcus. So we have head, you have greater tubercle, lesser tubercle, intertubercular sulcus. Coming on down the shaft then, as you run down, about a third of the way down, it starts to get really rough right there. That is called the deltoid tuberosity. That's where the deltoid muscle comes down to grab on to the shaft. Coming all the way down now, we're at your elbow. Okay, so at your elbow, what we notice, we have 2 condyles, and then we have 2 epicondyles, the bumps above it. This one we talked about before. That is called the trochlea. This one right here is called the capitulum. The trochlea is for the ulna. The capitulum is for the radius. So, that's an ulna, and that goes on the trochlea so you can raise and lower your arm. That's a radius. Notice how the top part looks like a hockey puck, and that's designed to go right over the capitulum. Now, the radius doesn't raise and lower your arm. What the radius does is that when it spins, there's a muscle that goes toward it, and when it pulls, it takes your arm and pulls your arm over. Then other muscles pull the radius, and it pulls back over this way. All right, so ulna does this, radius does this. Okay, so that trochlea is for the ulna, the capitulum is for the radius. Now, because I told you this is what points towards your ribs, this would be the medial epicondyle, this would be the lateral epicondyle. Easy way to remember this. You see that little space right there? There's nerves that run through there and blood vessels, and therefore that's when you hit that. That area is what you'd call your funny bone. It's right here. Okay. Last but not least, when I take the elbow and flip it around, that is called the olecranon fossa. Okay. If you remember, the back of the elbow was called olecranon. That was back in Unit 1. Why? Because that is the hole for the olecranon. Olecranon, I should say. What the hell is the olecranon? Look at your ulna. The top part of the C is called the olecranal process, or the olecranon. When you take your arm and you straighten it out, the olecranon goes into the olecranal fossa. Now, when you curl your arm up, this bottom part is called the coronoid process. It goes into this divot, which is called the coronoid fossa. It's just a matter of, do you extend your arm? You go in the olecranal fossa. Do you curl your arm? And now we go into the coronoid fossa. So, coronoid fossa in the back, the big one, olecranal fossa. All right, that's the humerus. All right, coming on down then, I already introduced you sort of to the ulna and the radius. Okay, now follow. If your arm is supine, going towards your pinky, that's your ulna. Going towards your going to your thumb, that is your radius. Real simple. Take your hand, do that. That ball right there, that ball is that right there. That's the head of your ulna. Okay? That's the easy way to remember. It's right there. Okay, so you have to know ulna. We don't got to know left or right. I already said we have this C part up here. The top part of the C is called the olecranal process. That's essentially the back of your elbow. This little part that sticks out is called the coronoid process. The whole C together is either called a semilunar notch or it is called the olecranal notch. Pick one. Doesn't make a difference. Sorry, not the olecranal notch. My bad. Trochlear notch. So forget the olecranal notch. I'm getting a little fatigued. So the whole C is either called a semilunar notch or it is called the trochlear notch. One of the two works. Now, if I take the trochlear notch and I turn it, notice there's a divot right there. That divot would be where the head of the radius sits. Okay? So that means when you spin your arm and you flip your wrist over, you're actually spinning this back and forth. So that is the facet for the radius. So that is called the radial facet. Coming all the way down now the shaft, we have the big ball. That's the head. And then we got this little tiny point sticking out, and that is the styloid process of the ulna. Okay, so we have ulna, olecranal process, coronoid process, trochlear semilunar notch. You have the radial facet, you have the ulnar head, and the styloid process of the ulna. Okay. Radius. This is the radial head. This bump right here is called the radial tuberosity. What is that bump for? That's the muscle that goes from here to here and will pull. It has to grab onto the radius. So this is sitting like here. And when it pulls, it makes the radius spin. So then when it spins, your wrist comes over like that. You can go back again. All right? But we'll cover that muscle when we get to muscles next unit. So radial head, radial tuberosity. Coming all the way down, notice there's a notch right there. That's the notch for the ulna. So that is called the ulnar notch. And then we have this point, which is the styloid process of the radius. Now, again, this is not the same skeleton, but if the two were to go together, they would go together. Hold on. Kind of like that. Oops, you gotta find the notch. There's the notch. Like that. Okay? So therefore, this would spin, and this is what raises and lowers your arm. Okay? Now, notice though when I do that, if you could stand up and look down. When I put these two together, the two styloid processes make this kind of cup shape. Who the hell cares? That's so your hand can fit in the cup. That's so your wrist bones can fit into it. So you can wave bye-bye. All right? So, moving on then, we now come to your hand. Okay, now for the hand, understand you got to know it when it's laying down prone and when it's supine. Now, I'm going to show it to you laying down prone because you can see the bones of the wrist more easily. So here we go. There's going to be carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Now follow. I'm going to cover up everything except for the carpals. Okay, those are the carpals. There's 8 of them. Now I'm going to cover up the carpals. I'm going to cover up the phalanges. Those are the metacarpals. That's the back of your hand. Then those are your phalanges, your fingers. Now, for the metacarpals and the phalanges, you number them from the thumb to the pinky. So you would call this metacarpal number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. You have to tell me that it's a metacarpal and what number it is, okay? Same thing with the phalanges. You go from the thumb to the pinky. So this would be phalanx number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But if you notice, the phalanges have smaller bones to them. Well, you have one that's proximal and one that's distal. So this would be proximal phalanx number 1. This would be distal phalanx number 1. Well, what if you have 3? Well, this would be proximal phalanx number 2, middle phalanx number 2, distal phalanx number 2. Same thing for the other ones. You would call them, 3 and 4 and 5. Now, wrist bones. Notice there's 8 of them. 4 on top, 4 on bottom. Okay? So, easy way to remember it, there's going to be one that's going to be kind of underneath your thumb, one that would be under your index finger, one that's kind of under your middle finger, and your last 2 have one big one underneath it, okay? So, we have the trapezium, the trapezoid, the capitate, and hamate. So, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. Now, the lower one, we have scaphoid, lunate, because if you take it out, it looks like a moon, triquetrum, and then this little one sticking out, that's called the pisciform. Even though when you look at it, it looks like pisciform, it's pisciform, meaning Pisces the fish. Okay, easy way to think about that one. When you do volleyball and you go to do the granny serve type of thing underhand, there's that part right there that sticks out. That is your pisciform. Okay, remember the ulna's over here. Pisciform is here. Okay, so again, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate, scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisciform. Those are all 8 of the wrist bones. So those are all carpals. Those are all example also of short bones too. All right, now we come to your pelvis. Okay. Now I'm going to show it to you together and then also taken apart because you got to know both. All right, so together, each half, you understand you have a left and a right. Those are called coxa, C-O-X-A. All right, so you got to tell left from right. So here's one that's ripped apart. How the hell do I tell what it is? Well, your leg has to attach here. This part would be where you would have your pubic bone, so your pubic hair would be here. This part would be where your sacrum attaches. So this would sit like this. This would be a left coxa. This would be a right coxa. When they come together, they would look like that, with the sacrum in the back. Okay? So for coxa, you got to know left and right. All right, so here we go. The coxa, whenever you're inside mommy, was 3 separate bones, fuses to make one in this hip socket. The hip socket is called the acetabulum. When you read it, when you look at it in the manual, it looks like acetabulum. It's pronounced acetabulum, but that's the hip socket. Okay. Now, this big part up here is called the ilium. The ilium makes up this part plus this part of the socket. This part right here, that's the pubic bone. Now we come to this under part, and that's called the ischium. So we have ilium, pubic, ischium. They all come together and fuse before you're born to make the acetabulum, the hip socket. Then you have this big hole right here. That big hole is called the obturator foramen. Obturator foramen is where you have major blood vessels and nerve endings going down your leg. If you ever watch TV and somebody gets cut on the inner leg, or they get pinned between 2 cars, and they say, well, they need to say goodbye before we take the cars apart because they're going to bleed out really quickly from that. That's because your femoral artery is going down there and basically will empty out your torso like that. All right, but that would be the word for the obturator foramen here. Okay, so then with this, so again, now let's look at it together because I have to show you the other parts. So that was one hip. When I put it together, notice this would be that, like that, okay? Now, when I put it together, there's a piece of cartilage in front holding the 2 coxa together. That's called the pubic symphysis. You got to know that too. Notice when I put the 2 coxa together, there's this angle right here. That is called the pubic angle. The pubic angle is important. Why? If this angle is greater than 90 degrees, it's a female. If it's less than 90 degrees, it's a male. Notice this is bigger than 90 degrees. This is a female pelvis. She has wider hips. Why? To facilitate childbirth, for the head and the body to drop down. This one that I showed you, even without the pubic symphysis and the sacrum, when I put it together, notice if I put the symphysis there, that angle right there is, right here, is less than 90 degrees. This is a male, okay? This is less than 90. That would be that pubic angle. All right, now back here, notice here's the sacrum, here's the ilium, and there's a crack right there. That crack is called the sacroiliac joint. Usually you don't recognize the sacroiliac joint unless you decide to lift something heavy and don't bend your knees and you go, ugh, and you lose your breath. That's because you pinched the nerve in there. All right, last but not least, just in case you didn't know, you're in the land of Disney. Watch. Focus on this circle right here, and I'm going to tilt it towards you. There's Mickey in your butt. You see Mickey? Mickey's right here. Here's the ear. Here's an ear. There's the head. Mickey Mouse is in your butt. Yeah, the little bastard is everywhere, I know. However, the ears of Mickey are what I'm trying to point at next. That's called the greater sciatic notch. So watch. If I take this, flip it around, this little fish hook right there, which is Mickey's ear, that's the sciatic notches, the greater sciatic notches. Okay? So again, for coxa, you got to know left and right. You got to know ilium, ischium, pubic. You have to know acetabulum, obturator foramen. You then also have to know the pubic symphysis, the sacroiliac joint. Notice whenever it's disarticulated, pubic symphysis would have been here. Sacroiliac joint is this rough part back here because the sacrum was taken out. The sacrum would be like that. Okay? Now, and then Mickey's ears, the greater sciatic notch. All right. So goodbye, Mr. Pelvis. Moving on down. Almost done. We got the femur. Femur, you have to know left and right too. This has to attach to you, and this notch back here is the back of your knee. So this would be a right leg. Okay? So you have to know femur. You have to know left versus right. Here we go. Other features. This is the femur head. The little divot in the head of the femur is called the capitis. I can't think anymore. It's the talk about. I hate it when that happens. It'll come to me. We have the neck. We have the greater trochanter, lesser trochanter. Running down the shaft on the back side, we have the line for your hamstrings, the linea aspera. Almost had it. It's capitis femoris, but the first thing is leaving my brain right now. Now down here, this is where your knee would be. Patella's here. This would be, now again, this is what attaches to your body. So anything on this side is medial. Anything on this side is toward the outside, lateral. This is the medial condyle, medial epicondyle, lateral condyle, lateral epicondyle. If I flip it around, that's the intercondylar sulcus. That's for your popliteal muscle to go through. Shut up.
I'm not laughing at you.
See, now I gotta look it up. That's gonna bother me until I get it. That damn first word screwed me up. It's the fovea capitis femoris. The fovea is a little pit. Damn it. I hate it. Anyway, but that's femur. Alright. Coming on down now. Again, understand. In front, there be your patella. You have to know patella. Looks like a stone you would skip across, a pond. Remember, it's called a sesamoid bone, which is a bone put in an area where you're put under stress, like your knee. Okay? Now, your tibia would sit like that, and your patella is sitting out front. So that's your tibia. Okay? So, take that away. Now we have your tibia, what you lovingly call your shin bone. Okay? So tibia, we have to know left and right too. Well, looking at this part, you can't tell. We have to come all the way down the diaphysis to find this little point sticking out right there. Real simple. When you run your hand down the inner part of your leg and you feel the inner ball of your ankle, the inner ball of your ankle is this. The outer ball of your ankle is a different bone. That's actually your fibula. And it's like that. It would go like that. Okay? So, the inner ball, your outer ball of your ankle. So the inner ball, that would be the medial side. So this right here is called the medial malleolus. Malleolus means hammer. Why? Because think, That little notch is going to provide an area for your foot to go into, and every time you walk, you're literally hammering your tibia into this bone. Therefore, it's called the little hammer, malleolus. So this would be the medial malleolus. Anything on this side now has to be medial. This is the medial condyle, lateral condyle. So you have to know tibia. Is it a left or right? This would be a right, because that would be the inside ball of your ankle. So tibia, left and right. Medial condyle, lateral condyle, medial malleolus. That's what you got to know. For the fibula, fibula is found on the lateral side. Fibula looks like that. Now follow. If this is the medial malleolus, this would have to be the lateral malleolus, the outside ball of your ankle. So you have to know fibula, lateral malleolus, and this is the head. The head is what rubs against the tibia up here. Okay? All right. Last but not least, stinky foot. Ugliest part of the human body. All right, so again, kind of like with the wrist. Now we don't have carpals, we have tarsals. So notice I'm going to cover up all this. Those are your ankle bones. Those are your tarsals. I'm going to cover up all the tarsals. Those are your metatarsals, meaning the top part of your foot. Cover up those. Those are your tootsies, your phalanges. Okay? Same thing with the metacarpals as metatarsals. Same thing with the toes as well as the fingers. In this case now, we start with the great toe and we go to the piggy toe. So this would be metatarsal number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Phalanx number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But again, like before, we're going to have proximal and distal. And on the other 4 toes, you're going to have proximal, middle, and distal. So if I pointed to, say, this one right there, that little one right there, that would be distal phalanx number 4. Okay? This would be metacarpal number 3. Metatarsal number 3. Now, let's then talk about your ankle bones. Okay? Now, first one. Notice this big one back here. That's your heel bone. That's called the calcaneus. There's a tendon that attaches called the calcaneal tendon or the Achilles tendon that you would think of. But that's the calcaneus, one of the hardest bones in the human body because you pound it daily. This part right here that looks smooth, again, the spring is optional. You don't have that in you. But this is called the talus. The talus is so you can take your ankle and wave it back and forth. Again, the talus is what this sits on, the medial malleolus, so that you can move your foot back and forth. But that allows you to wave your foot if you want to. So we got calcaneus, talus. Now I'm going to go down toward the great toe. So we have talus. This bone right here, try to get it right there, that's called the navicular. Then we have 1, 2, 3 bones in a row. Those are all called cuneiform, kind of like the ancient form of writing. This would be toward the middle. This is the medial cuneiform, middle cuneiform, lateral cuneiform, and then last but not least, cuboid. So run through it again. We have calcaneus, talus, navicular, medial cuneiform, middle cuneiform, lateral cuneiform, cuboid. And I think I covered everything. All right, so that would be the anatomy of the skeleton. Granted, if you were with me, you'd actually be playing with the bones and looking at them, and it means a lot more. Hopefully this is something a little more instructive than just looking at some sketches or some drawings, I'm hoping. All right, so that ends the anatomy of the skeleton, and that ends the lab portion for Unit 3. See you in Unit 4.